On behalf of IIP Technical Team, I, Dr. Uttara Mohan, welcome you to this webinar on decoding rehabilitation for spinal muscular atrophy by resource person Dr. Amrita Paranjpe. We are streaming live on IIP India YouTube channel. I request everyone to subscribe to this channel to get regular update during our webinars. You can also follow our notifications on the IIP Facebook page. This webinar is being organized by IIP Women's Cell Latur district of Maharashtra. The moderators for today's session are Dr. Pallavi Dangat Zadav, Dr. Neha Singh Mandade, and Dr. Sheetal Ghulefar. I request the moderators to start with the session.
Good morning. Good morning, all. Hello and good morning, my dear participants. This is Dr. Pallavi Dangat Zadav, Coordinator IIP Women's Cell Latur, along with Dr. Neha Singh Mandade and Sheetal Ghulefar, Sub-Coordinator of Latur IIP District. We welcome all of you for today's webinar on decoding of rehabilitation for spinal muscular atrophy on behalf of Latur IIP WC and Maharashtra State team. We were found in June 2018 and conducted various activities and webinars under the guidance of Maharashtra IIP WC team. IIP WC team was started on 30th of May 2018. Its function under the guidance of National Head IIP President Dr. Sanjeev Jha sir and Dr. Ruchi Vaishnav ma'am. We have 5 zones in India with heads for each. Dr. Pooja Kamre is the West Zonal Head. IIPWC works towards conducting public awareness camps, CMEs, workshops, and webinars for the professionals. It aims to bring together all the physiotherapist professionals for sharing their knowledge and improving public awareness about the physiotherapy. The state IIP team includes state coordinator Dr. Suvarna Ganvir ma'am, joint coordinator Dr. Snehal Patel, and sub-coordinator Dr. Uttara Mohan, Dr. Nirali Sangvi, and Dr. Priya Karande. In Maharashtra, IIPWC has conducted 40 plus low-cost activities and near about 50 free webinars in various districts of Maharashtra. In first corporate IIP conference held in Indore in April 2019, Maharashtra had received award for the best state IIPWC. As we all know, August is a month for the awareness of spinal muscular atrophy. We, the IIP WC team, Latur team, has made a small effort to contribute for the awareness of the spinal muscular atrophy through this webinar. And today we are fortunate to have an eminent speaker among us, respected Dr. Amrita Paranjpe ma'am. She is HOD of Aquatic Therapy and Chief Scientific Officer in Neurogen Brain and Spine Institute. She is also a Vice Chairperson, Managing Committee of Asha Ek Hope Foundation. She is Secretary at Aquatic Therapy Network of India, that is ATNI. She has done her master's from Sheffield Hallam University, UK. She is also a certified aquatic therapist from Switzerland, a certified vastu practitioner, and a certified cardiovascular rehabilitation from University of Chester, UK. Ma'am has 11 years of clinical experience in aquatic therapy and rehabilitation post regenerative medicine therapy. First to set up the Aquatic Therapy Center with indoor heating pool in Mumbai and heading the department from last 5 years. She has been part of inception and foundation of Aquatic Therapy Network in India. She has conducted more than 6 national and 2 international aquatic therapy workshops and was invited as a speaker for the same internationally. She has conducted several webinars on role of rehabilitation in regenerative medicines and aquatic therapy in various disorders. She has authored 1 book on spinal cord injury and also co-authored 4 chapters in various books which is on neurological disorders. She has 30 scientific paper publications into her credit and has been awarded as the first prize as a young scientist by Stem Cell Society India in 2018 and also a second prize as a young scientist by International Association of Neurorestorology in 2014. Now, before moving on for today's webinar, I would request my all participants to please mute your microphones and switch off your cameras for smooth proceeding. Participants can put their questions in a chat box and we will try to answer them as much as possible during question and answer session. I now request Dr. Amruta to continue further with the presentation. Amruta ma'am, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a wonderful introduction, first of all. And I would really like to thank IAPW Women's Cell from Latur for giving me this opportunity to speak about SMA. I am also, as you said earlier, I am a vice chairperson for Motor Neuron Disease Foundation, Asha 4. So neuromuscular disorders are something of a lot of my interest, not just professionally, but also on a personal level. I connect with that. And so, as much as I can do to help patients and as well as professionals to get more awareness about the disorders and get more awareness about how we can do rehabilitation in them, what are the new treatments that are available right now. I try to do my bit for that and contribute in the way I can. So, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I think I'll start sharing the screen so we can all see the presentation.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. All
Yes,
right.
ma'am.
So, great. So, just to start with what is muscular dystrophy, I'm going to give a quick introduction about what the disease is and what are the symptoms and signs that we see, how we assess the patients, what are the limitations that the patients experience, and then I would move on to the management of the condition. I have kept the physiotherapy part a bit brief because we are all, I mean, I'm sure these are all professionals who are attending the webinar today, and of course some of physiotherapy students as well must be attending, but we've already studied about physiotherapy in neuromuscular disorders in our in our syllabi. What is new is how we can use aquatic therapy for muscular atrophy, spinal muscular atrophy. So I have focused a little bit more on that, and I've kept the physiotherapy part a little bit short. But of course, if somebody wants to know more, maybe in this question answer session, I can talk more about it. So, how common is this disease? And what we need to know is that it is not as rare as it seems. Okay, there is a bit of thought process that neuromuscular disorders are very rare, but it's not. It's about 1 to 2 in every 10,000 children that we get to see this disease. So every year there are about 6 to 10,000 new children born with SMA. It is incurable, irreversible, progressive, and fatal. So that's why it's extremely important for us to, find out new treatment strategies or to find out new ways in even rehabilitation to make sure that we give the best quality of life that is possible to these patients. So what happens in spinal muscular atrophy? So when we all know the normal nerve function, the brain generates the signal, the nerves carry it, and the muscles respond to that to perform a movement. Now, in spinal muscular atrophy, the motor neuron, it is a motor neuron disease. So the motor neurons are affected. And so brain generates the signal, but the nerves are not able to conduct it to the muscles, which results in subsequent atrophy of the muscle. So if you see here in this picture, the nerves are damaged, and that's why the signal carrying is basically impaired. So it's what is the pathophysiology? So it's basically because of SMN1 and SMN2 genes that are responsible for cause of SMA. So in if you can see here in the unaffected, that is children who do not have SMA, the SMN1 gene is intact. Now this is a sensory, sorry, this is a motor neuron, survival motor neuron gene, which is responsible for protecting or which is responsible for keeping the integrity of the nerve cells. Okay, so this SMN1 gene leads to functional SMN protein. So this translates into a functional SMN protein. There is another gene which is SMN2. It is called a pseudogene. Okay. Now, what are these pseudogenes? Pseudogenes are the genes that have evolved, over the 1,000 years of evolution. We have evolved to form these pseudogenes, and these are the, you can say, these are bad copies of the actual gene. All right, so they do not cause any harm, but they are not fully functional. So if you see here, the SMN2 gene, it produces the protein, but in very small amounts. So out of the 10, you can see maybe one would be the correct full length protein that is produced. So these two genes are available in our body. Now, what happens in SMA is this SMN1 gene is deleted. Okay, so our DNA of the children who have SMA does not have SMN1 gene, and therefore there is no survival motor neuron protein that is available. But SMN2 gene is still there, and it does, form some amount of protein, which is not enough. Maybe about 10% of the actual requirement of the protein can be met by SMN2 gene. Most of it is non-functional. So SMA is basically caused because of the deletion of SMN1 gene in the body. It has autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. So it means that both the parents are carriers when the child gets the disease. If any one of the parents is a carrier, then the children will not get it. And there's a very small, there's a lesser chance of children getting. It's about 25%. And despite of this, it's not really a very rare disorder. So where is this survival motor neuron protein, required? Or which parts of the nerves or body is it required? So if you see here, it's required in every part of the nerve, right from the, cell body to the axons to the synapses. Everywhere the SMN is required. So if it's not present, the entire nerve function is sort of hampered. Now, is that all? Is that because there is a gene deletion, and is that's causing the the whole symptoms of the disease? So there is another aspect to this, and that is pathophysiology, the imbalance in the pathophysiology. So if you see here, there is muscle injury and the nerve injury, and there are repair mechanisms. Okay, there is a gross imbalance here because the injury is so much because of the deletion of the gene. The nerves are not forming properly, and therefore there is a lot of injury also, and the repair mechanisms are not there. So there is nothing to regenerate these nerves from, in the body once this protein is faulty. So you can see here, as the disease progresses, the regenerative capacity of the nerves also goes on reducing. So initially it is just at the presynaptic level. When there is an onset, the synaptic and functional degeneration is there. This causes fatigue and weakness. Slowly, as the disease progresses, there is chromatolysis in the nerve cell, and this causes weakness, further weakness and atrophy. And then there is a neuronal loss and a severe muscle loss also. So there's severe wasting of the muscles. And obviously, at this stage, the regenerative capacity is very poor. So the newer treatments that are coming in picture, which are gene modifying treatments or even the stem cell treatments. So there are two aspects. Either we can do something about the injury, or we can enhance the repair mechanisms. By both these strategies, we can help these patients. So to reduce the injury, there is the gene therapy strategies that are coming in picture, which is a more definitive treatment option. And then there is regenerative medicine, which helps in sort of in repairing that injury or repairing the damaged part of the neurons. However, if we don't do it earlier on in the disease, then the effect of that or the benefits that we can get from that are very limited. So if you see here, so our brain is connected to the spinal cord, to, of course, the neuronal bodies, and that is called as the upper motor neuron. At the neuron, it synapses on some other neurons, and they branch out to give the peripheral circulation. So I'm not going to go into the anatomy and details of that, but just to briefly point that out. So there's an upper motor neuron, and it crosses over at the anterior horn cell. and then there is a lower motor neuron that actually reaches the muscles. Now this is the lower motor neuron is the are the neurons that are affected in SMA. So it is not an upper motor neuron disease, it is a lower motor neuron disease, and that is the difference between SMA and many of the other motor neuron diseases. So earlier SMA was also characterized into the whole umbrella term of motor neuron disease, which included ALS, PLS, PMA, and all of those disorders. However, now it is a separate entity. It has been in the ICD. It has been given a separate entity because we know there is a definite genetic cause for it, and it is purely a lower motor neuron disorder. So, what happens when there is a lower motor neuron, involvement? Of course, it leads to flaccid paralysis. So, all of these children you will see have a very flail or flaccid body and muscles. The tone is extremely low, and when the tone is low, the atrophy, of course, is the next step. So there's a severe atrophy of the muscles as well. Uh, they do not show spasticity. So if you see in upper motor neuron disorders or in cerebral disorders as well, there is increase in the muscle tone and spasticity, which to a certain extent helps to preserve the muscle as well. So the atrophy is slightly lesser when the muscle is spastic. But here there is no spasticity. It is absolutely flaccid, low tone paralysis that we see. Paralysis is eventual. Earlier on, of course, we see muscle weakness and inability to build the muscles. So I will explain different types of SMA and how things function in that. It also affects the neuromuscular junction. Um, Now, when it affects enough number of neuromuscular junctions, then the movements or the contractions of the muscles are very spontaneous, or they're not controlled, and that leads to fasciculation. So there is small amount of activity in the muscles. So the neuromuscular junction is sort of, it's like on radio when there is a lot of disturbance, how we hear the sound. It's very broken and it's not a proper complete sound. There's something, but it's not enough. It's just like that. The fasciculations are just like that in terms of muscle contraction and how the muscle contraction is stimulated. It also affects the deep tendon reflexes, the low motor neuron, the alpha neurons. Those are the ones that cause the deep tendon reflexes. So you see that when this is affected, the reflexes are also diminished and sometimes not even present in many of the children. So these are classic signs that with which we can sort of find out or understand that children may have SMA earlier on, before they really show the signs of absolute muscle weakness, or before they have even developed enough for us to understand there is weakness. So low tone, diminished reflexes, and fasciculations are three main signs for that. So now, coming back to the pathophysiology of SMA, as to, so we know that yes, this one gene is not functional, but I also told you there is another SMN2 gene which produces some amount of protein, though not enough. So is that what is causing different types of SMA? Yes, it is. So what happens is the how many copies of SMN gene we have decides the severity of the disease. So this is a pseudo gene, as I said. So it's like a bad copy of the original gene. So we have this in variations. So not all of us have the same amount of SMN2 genes in our body. All of us have SMN1 gene and the two copies of that, not more. But SMN2 can exist in multiple numbers or in multiple copies. So people can have 2, 4, and some have also shown to have 8 copies of the same gene. Now, what matters is people who do not have SMN1, if they have more number of SMN2 genes, then obviously the severity of the disease is much lesser because it is producing some amount of functional protein. So if one gene produces, say, about 5% of the functional protein, having 4 copies of the same gene will give you 20% of the functional protein. So the severity of the disease, progression of the disease will vary a lot. So severity would be much lesser with more number of copies of SMN2, and progression will be much slower with more number of copies of SMN2. So many of the treatments or the new strategies, gene therapy strategies that are coming in play, they try and target the SMN2 gene because this is not there. So we can't to insert SMN1 gene in the DNA. That is a massive task, but we have something at hand which we can manipulate and try and see if more and more copies of, our healthy protein or full length protein can be produced. So there is a role that physiotherapists also play in these newer treatment strategies, and I'm going to come to that. So these are the, to briefly sort of give you an understanding of what are the different types. There are four types broadly. Type 1, which is the most common of all of the types of SMA. It has two types again. In type 1, there is type 1A and type 1B. I have not given entire distinction because I didn't want to go too much in detail. So type 1 is the most common, most severe form of the disease that usually where we start seeing the symptoms before 6 months of age. Okay, so they have they, uh, basically they have muscle weakness and low tone paralysis, so they cannot develop the milestones at all, and there is no buildup of the activities. There is no buildup of, there's no motor learning happening because the nerves are already affected. And these children show breathing difficulty right in the beginning, so they have severe breathing, swallowing difficulty, and because they cannot swallow properly, there's a huge risk of aspiration and aspiration pneumonia and fatality in these children because of that as well. They may be dependent on an external respiratory support right, from very young age. And so this is the most severe, which is also known as Worden-Hoffmann disease. Worden-Hoffmann disease is actually type 1B, which is where we see the symptoms from 0 to 6 months. Type 1A is also equally severe, but the symptoms are seen even before birth, that is, in the womb. The mother feels that the movement of the children is also less. So, type 1A sort of exhibits itself even before birth. Then there is type 2, where the children show symptoms after 6 months of age. There is delay in the milestones. Some children do not achieve the milestones at all. They may be able to sit up, but walking may be very difficult or almost impossible for many of them. And they usually are wheelchair bound. In type 1, the children may not even be able to sit up. So the milestone development is severely regressed in type 1 as compared to type 2. Now, type 3 is a less severe form of the three, and you usually see the symptoms after 18 months of age. Again, these children have difficulties in achieving the milestones, but with right training, we may be able to get them to stand and maybe even walk with support. Then there is one very rare type 4, where there are a lot of copies of SMN2. And so generally the symptoms are seen in the adulthood, anywhere between 18 to 35. This goes more in the motor neuron disease category of, lower motor neuron disease. But there may be genetic involvement of SMN1, and that's why it's characterized as SMA type 4. So, yeah, I think I've already explained to this. So in type 1B, it's also called as infantile SMS. The child seems normal at birth, although with a little bit of hypotonia. What we see that the weakness is progressive, and there is weakness of chewing, swallowing, sucking as well. So great risk of aspiration. Uh, there is weakness in the chest wall and diaphragm, so the children may have breathing and difficulty and respiratory difficulties quite earlier on in the disease. What we see is that the proximal weakness is more as compared to the distal weakness, and for children, it is very difficult to even achieve the milestones of sitting up. So, doing any anti gravity work is very difficult for them. So as the types progress, of course, the severity reduces. In type 2, 3, and 4, the chronic symptoms that we see, or when children grow older, even in type 1A and B, but these symptoms are seen much earlier in 1A and B, that they may have scoliosis, cachectic body, so this severe wasting of all the muscles. And of course, there may be a severe respiratory impairment as well. So, for physiotherapy for SMA, I've just given brief pointers. I have not gone into details. What we need to understand is we need to do motor training and retraining exercises. We need to do strengthening exercises. Management of contractures plays a great role because all of these patients, they have severe atrophy, and we all know that when there is low tone, the chances of contractures are much higher, because there is absolutely no muscle to, no muscle function to combat, and the fibrosis is much more in the muscle that does not have tone, because it's easier to lose the properties of muscle when the tone is low. In high tone, the muscle properties are still preserved for a little longer time. So these children are at the maximum risk of developing contractures, and our job as a physiotherapist is to prevent those from occurring. We have to make sure that we give the last, we preserve the range, we preserve the elasticity of the muscles, and try to preserve the function as much as possible. Earlier on in the disease, respiratory management takes precedence. As physiotherapists, we generally do not focus a lot on respiratory function of patients. When we specialize in different streams, maybe orthopedic, neurological. Of course, if we specialize in chest physiotherapy, then we do look into it. But so I have, I've been working with neurological patients for the last 10 years now. So earlier on, when I started my practice, I did not focus so much on the respiratory management, unless it was very evident that they have breathing problems and they have respiratory weakness, like in case of motor neuron disease and muscular dystrophies and even SMA. But not earlier on. I never gave the management as a preventive management for to preserve respiratory function. That was something that was not very ingrained in our teaching, although we were taught that we are supposed to do it, but it was not very highlighted that this is very important. So I would like to highlight that respiratory management is extremely important. Even if we have not specialized as respiratory physiotherapist, as a neurophysiotherapist, I must know what to do with my clients or patients for to improve their respiration. And if you feel the need, then do refer them to a respiratory physiotherapist for the respiratory care, because it's extremely important. For SMA, the fatality is because of respiratory complications more often than not, aspiration pneumonia. And we do not want that. We can prevent it. We can give an extended life to these patients just by doing the right, kind of rehabilitation. So if you have any, doubts about this, you can refer to another colleague of yours who is probably well versed with respiratory management. Orthotics, splinting, and taping also play a huge role, because, as I said, these patients are at a great risk of developing contractures, and we cannot prevent contractures only by stretching the muscles. Uh, that happens when the muscle is, or the muscle, properties are maintained, and the neuromotor function is maintained. But we cannot do that when the muscle function is not maintained at all. The neuromotor unit is dysfunctional. It's not possible to just give stretching for the muscle. So we have to use orthotics. We have to use splinting to prevent the contractures. If the contractures have set in, yes, of course, we need to use stretching and taping. And there also orthotics plays a great role, because we can, serially or graded stretch can be given, or a sustained stretch can be given with the orthotics. Again, as physiotherapists, we are not very well versed with splinting. We do use splinting a lot, but it is not a major chunk of our syllabus when we are studying. So, what I would request everybody is to refer your patients to occupational therapists, especially for splinting. For upper limb splinting, all the more. We are very well versed with lower limb splinting, and the trunk splinting we are comfortable with. Uh, of course, you can get yourself trained and educated to do it, but if you're not confident, then do refer them to occupational therapists. They can do a very good job with that. And then what we have to understand is we have to promote activity. So it's not exercises, is not just doing a repetition of uh, like a same movement 10 times. That is exercise, but that is not all that constitutes as exercise. We have to facilitate activity in these children. What we have to realize is that these are young children who do not want to be sort of bound in a routine, or they don't want to be bound in a disciplined, boring way of exercises. So we have to make it very interesting, and so we have to combine it with activities. We have to make it interesting for them. We have to make it as a part of their day-to-day life, and so they do it more and more and more. It is extremely important that they do the activities multiple number of times, so that the nerves get that input, get that. There is a need for the nerves to be preserved. If we don't give them activities, the nerves will wither away much faster than if we do give them activities. So it's important that beyond our session, so we give a session for an hour, maybe, or hour and a half, maybe twice in a day we give 1 hour. But beyond that, 22 hours they are at home. If they are not moving, if there is no activity, then whatever exercises you've given are going to have a very little effect on the child. So we have to make sure we give them home program, a carryover program, activities that they can intersperse in their day-to-day life. We can teach the parents how to get their children to be more active, and that's very important part of our job as well. So what I've tried to do is I have I've tried to give you a sort of a view of the multidisciplinary rehab that is required in SMA. It is like a bird's eye view. Everything I put in one slide just to for you to understand that we are not the only professionals that are going to work with these children, and we should not be the only professionals that are working with these children. So as a physiotherapist, it is our responsibility to involve other members and other professionals in the team for the management of these children. If they already are not there, if they're not getting that kind of treatment or attention, it is our responsibility to make the patients aware that they require all of these treatments as well. It is very tempting to do everything ourselves, but I would strongly recommend against it. Go for a multidisciplinary team approach because that gives the best results. So I've sort of categorized the disease in three parts. Stage one is the early phase of the disease. Stage two is the when the disease is a little more advanced, and stage three is a very advanced form of the disease. I'm going to give you two different patterns of how the rehab team should be involved in these cases or at these stages. Because if you see the SMA 1 and 2, their progression is much faster and much earlier as compared to SMA 3 and 4. So for 3 and 4, I've given a different strategy. For 1 and 2, I'm going to give you a different strategy. Of course, stage one, extremely important, is physiotherapy. You have to start physiotherapy as early as possible in the disease, maybe as soon as 6 months or 3 months or 4 months, if you know at that point. Occupational therapy in phase one is important, but I've put it as yellow as so the importance of physiotherapy here is much more because the child needs a lot of physical retraining, and the splinting or the adaptive devices or the functional movements at that early age, take a little bit of backseat, but the importance goes on increasing as the child grows up. Speech therapy is very important because these children have a lot of difficulty in swallowing and chewing. And a lot of times what happens, even in professionals, we have the understanding that speech therapy is for speech disorders. So if the child is not able to speak or communicate, then that is the time we need to refer the child to speech therapist. But this child has a perfectly functional brain. Their understanding is proper. There's no problems in communication, there's no problem in speech, they can talk. Then why do we need a speech therapist? But the speech therapists also play a very important part in facilitating chewing as well as swallowing. These are the two functions that we do not always understand, that speech therapists can influence or they can improve, or we take it for granted. We take chewing and swallowing for granted. Chewing, still we understand that yes, it requires a little bit of effort, but swallowing is something that we've all taken for granted a lot. We do not realize the kind of effort and the kind of training that is required to improve swallowing. We don't understand that yes, if we give correct amount of exercises, the swallowing can be better. And so recognize that, and start speech therapy right in the beginning of the disease, in the early phase. Then of course aquatic therapy is something very close to my heart because uh, I practice aquatic therapy, and I will come to this in detail later on as to how it can help in these children. But that should also be started much earlier on. We do not have infrastructure at the moment where we can give this kind of therapy to children in that young and early age. So that's what I strive for, that we can get more and more aquatic therapists. And it will be very wrong if I suggest me. It is more of we at the ATNI as well, that we are trying to grow the profession in the country so that it's available for all the patients that really require it a lot. And it's available in every hospital in the most, in the therapeutic sort of a setup, because we cannot perform aquatic therapy in in any other pool, especially for children with SMA. Their immunity levels are very low. They have swallowing issues, so if you take them in the public swimming pools, that can be a big health hazard for them as well. So we need good setups, good therapeutic setups to provide aquatic therapy. uh, Respiratory management again is very important right in the beginning, but the other three take precedence. Psychological intervention. Now, you may wonder, okay, for a child before 6 months, what psychological intervention is required? So, the psychological intervention is not for the children. What we have to understand, that if we have to improve the quality of life of the child, we have to treat the child along with the family. They're not two separate units. It's a one single unit that you're trying to address. So you cannot treat the child without treating the family, and you cannot treat the or you cannot help the family without treating the child. It goes hand in hand. And so it is extremely important that you do offer this awareness to the parents, that there is help available for them as well if they cannot cope up. Because if parents do not cope up with the fact that their children have SMA and how to manage their children, then the entire management of the child suffers a lot. You have to have a very strong, motivated parent to make sure that the children are being taken care of well. And it is a difficult situation. We cannot understand what it is like, to be a parent of a special child, or to be a parent of a child with such neuromuscular disorders, which are progressive and which are so disabling. And therefore, we have to give that awareness. We cannot, of course, we can't do the psychological management for the parents. We can't do counseling. We can, on a non sort of professional way, speak with them, talk to them, but we can't offer them definite strategies to cope up with the stress that they have, or to cope up with the dilemmas, or depression, anxiety. There can be a huge amount of psychological consequences of SMA on the parents. And so it's very important. That's why I put it in green. It's as important as the physiotherapy and speech therapy of the child and the aquatic therapy of the child. It's as important as that. So parents have to take care of themselves, especially emotionally, right in the beginning, in the stage one, because the child's requirement in that stage are still manageable. As it grows, as the disease grows, as the child grows up as well, it's more demanding for the parents to take care of the child. And so right in the beginning, if we offer this to them, then they are more prepared for what's coming next. This is the phase where we have to start introducing splinting, and different splints, for especially the night splints, because if the child is not able to even elicit the movements or learn the movements, then they are going to go in contractures very quickly, and very there can be multiple contractures in the body. And so we have to introduce splinting at this time. It is not to improve function. The splinting is mainly to prevent contractures. Now, in stage two, occupational therapy also becomes very important. Speech therapy, aquatic therapy continues. Orthopedic management may be considered. So here I'm talking about actual orthopedic surgical intervention uh, for contractures, if there are severe contractures that may be required, not always, but it can be contemplated. Nutritional management is of essence, because in stage one, the children are still very young, they are well fed, there is some amount of movement, and the appetite is not lost so much. But in stage two, as the disease progresses, as the children grow, the activity levels are dropping and dropping. So they're not dropping, but activity levels are not increasing as they do in typical children. And so the appetite also doesn't increase, and the children tend to eat lesser and lesser. And that hampers their nutrition as well. So if the children are eating less, what can be, what should be given to them is very important. What kind, how we can make it nutritious is very important. And that management has to start in the middle of the progression of the disease. And of course, we can't advise on that as physiotherapists. So we have to introduce a dietitian or a nutritionist in picture at this stage, so that they can get a proper nutritional management as well. Some children may have gastrointestinal problems, constipation, and so we need to address that, because that will also hamper or affect their physical motor performance. Respiratory management again becomes very essential at this phase, because children will have a lot of respiratory weakness. Psychological intervention, it's important, but now if you've already done it right in the phase one, here it starts declining. The importance starts declining because parents are prepared. If you feel well, do insist about that as well. This is a phase where we have to give adaptive devices to promote function in the children, um, because we've got time as physiotherapists to train them and develop certain movements. Maybe the child is now able to sit. Maybe the child is able to hold his or her head. Maybe the child is able to do some movement with the distal body parts, uh, and so we need to enhance that. And these devices can be given. So you can see here, for a child who does not have enough strength, and the food keeps slipping as they're trying to eat, there is a plate guard, there are cups with two handles on both the sides. Now these are the things that again we do not, uh, I wouldn't say we do not provide, we can provide, but these are not the things that we do learn a great deal about in our training or in our education. This is something that the occupational therapists are very well versed with, and chunk of their training, consists of how to improve function through all of these devices as well. So do refer your patients to occupational therapists for all of these activities as well. In stage 3, everything is important, because this is almost the advanced terminal stage of the disease, where the child is extremely debilitated and has a very low motor function as well as respiratory function. The cardiac management also becomes important here, because when the respiratory function is compromised for so long, then the cardiac management, the heart also suffers, and cardiac management becomes more important. And many of the children may go on either BiPAP, so either non-invasive or invasive ventilation. When children are on invasive ventilation, the respiratory physiotherapy becomes all the more important, even on non-invasive ventilation. And what we have to understand is the prime goal of the physiotherapy in that stage is secretion clearance. We cannot hope to regain the strength of the inspiratory muscles. So, yes, we keep training them to prevent further loss of the strength, but the most important aspect of respiratory physiotherapy in the later stages becomes secretion clearance. Now, this is for type 2 and type 3 of SMA. Uh, Sorry, type 3 and type 4 of SMA, where it's more of adult, not adult onset, but the children do have a fairly developed childhood, like where they develop good milestones, and then later on the weakness sets in. So the weakness doesn't start right in the earlier on in the disease. Sometimes in type 3, yes, it can start as early as 2 years, and children may require a lot of training to achieve their milestones. Then they maintain those milestones for a couple of years, and then they start declining again. That also happens. So keeping that in picture, on in stage 1 you mainly need psychological intervention for the parents to make them aware of what is coming in future, and how to cope up with it, or how to manage that. I missed one point in the previous slide. So here in the phase 3, when we talk about psychological intervention, at this time it is also for the children, because by this time the children have sort of reached their teenagers. They are grown up enough to understand uh, their condition. They are grown up enough to understand a few things, but not everything. And so they are in the confused state of mind. They can be lost a lot of behavioral abnormalities. There can be anger issues, there can be tantrums, uh, and all of these also need to be addressed, and parents may not be equipped to understand how to address these problems or how to cope up with these problems. So we need to refer children as well for psychological intervention in the later stages. So now coming back to phase 3, type 3 and type 4. In phase 1, psychological intervention is the most important. In phase 2, of course, physiotherapy occupational therapy, aquatic therapy, and respiratory management starts. These children will not have immediate swallowing difficulties. It will start later on, and therefore the speech therapy part can be delayed a little bit. It comes in picture. So in phase three, again, occupational therapy becomes more important. Orthopedic and nutritional management also is required because now may be the time. And so in stage two, they're gaining physical activity. In stage three, they may be stagnant at that, and that gain may be stagnant, or they may start declining. So we have to see based on that. And we may have to look at the cardiac management because these children have grown up but not grown up with enough activity, so we don't know how strong the cardiovascular system or how developed the cardiovascular system is. They may require splinting at this stage, so from whatever we saw in stage 1 kind of gets delayed to stage 3 in these children, where now the weakness has started setting in and they require this to prevent further contractures. In stage 4, of course, everything is important, and we do need to introduce adaptive devices as well. Adaptive devices can be introduced even at stage 3, uh, to sort of make sure that they have, we can facilitate function and they achieve functional activities. And again, in stage 5, all of the management is required, and children are already on ventilators by this stage. So respiratory management is the most important at this in this stage of the disease. So I've just given certain examples. I'm going to just quickly go through these images. What we need to do is make sure that we give a lot of active exercises. What happens is we generally focus on, because these children tend to have a lot of contractures, we focus on stretches, but we sometimes forget that active exercises are the best way of training and to prevent contractures as well. So focus on active exercises, whatever they can do. And it may be that the children are not able to do a lot of activity, then we find out ways to perform active exercises. So yeah, these are just active exercises that can be done by the children themselves, for trunk, for hips, for for balance training. What we need to understand is if they are not able to do active exercises without any assistance, then what how we can promote that. And suspension exercises is an excellent way of achieving that. Something that we learn in, I think second, I learned in first and second year of my bachelor training. uh, so we learn it in that years, and then as we grow more in our profession, uh, and if we especially take the orthopedic route, or if we go the neuro route, we deal more with stroke and cerebral palsy and head injury, and maybe a little bit of NDT way or the motor training way, and we lose track of, or we forget about a very good modality that we had learned about, which is suspension exercises. These are exercises which are these are the most important exercises in neuromuscular disorders, because here you have the opportunity for repeating an exercise, even hundreds of times if required, without burdening the muscles so much, and yet giving a huge sensory input and huge input for motor training or motor learning. So this is very important. Try and give as many active and active assisted exercises in the suspension, in the uh, fabric of suspension exercises. We can give suspension exercise for every joint and every muscle in our body. We just have to be more creative and understand how it can be done. We can also add a little bit of resistance to these exercises if required. So if the child is not able to perform against gravity, but the movements are very good in gravity eliminated plane, and you want to challenge the child a little bit more, then you can do this. Or you can just make them do active assisted exercises wherever they can. So uh, these children are more of adult onset. Of course, you need to train them for gait with splints. There are various ways of doing it. I have shown with rigid splinting for the knees, and a little bit it reaches all the way to the hips, because the child's hip and knee stability was very poor. And uh, what I would like to stress on is a lot of there's a lot of conflict between should rigid splinting be given to these children or not. My experience with neuromuscular disorders is that yes, this is the only modality, or this is the only way of splinting that really helps to preserve the function. If you don't give enough support to the legs, then the children are not able to uh, stabilize themselves, their trunks, and or they're not able to walk at all. So don't shy away from that. Respiratory exercises, of course, again are very important. We are just trying to show them diaphragmatic exercises here, give the inspiratory spirometers, give the pursed lip breathing. And in the later stages of the disease, it is very important to give secretion clearance exercises like post exhalations, HCBT techniques. You also need to do give strategies for getting enough breath or enough tidal volume with the relatively shallow breaths that are available to us. So there's something called hyperventilation, where you breathe shallow and
Yeah, we were on the respiratory exercises. So what we need to understand is there are different types of respiratory exercises that we need to give in different phases of the disease. Here we are talking about we have given some of the inspiratory muscle strengthening sort of exercises where we can give the feedback to the muscles. We can give inspiratory spirometers. Can you go on the next slide, Neha? Uh, no. Oh, this is. Oh, just keep on moving ahead because we have completed the stretches already. Yeah, next, next. Yeah, okay. Just wait on this slide. So for respiratory exercise, I think I've not added about the explanation about no. Go back on the previous slide. Yeah. So in the respiratory exercise, I've not added a lot of explanation about breath stacking. That's what I was telling about when I think I got disconnected. What is important is to understand that they have a very shallow breathing ability, and even with that shallow breathing, it's important for us to provide enough tidal volume. And how we can do that? So there is a very good technique called breath stacking, which means that you take shallow breaths and do not exhale unless you have attained a certain amount of tidal volume. And that technique can really give and help in maintaining the lung compliance very well, and it can give a very good sort of inspiratory volume to us as well. We can do it with ambu bag. We can do it. Patients can do it voluntarily themselves, or we can do it with ambu bag as well. Can be done even with the NIV. There are certain machines available in the market called cough assist, which are for secretion removal, which takes precedence in the advanced stage of the disease, because at that time it is may be very difficult to train for the inspiratory muscle or to improve the strength of the inspiratory muscles with the amount of nerve loss and the muscle loss we already have. But what we can do is prevent the secretions from building up, because those are the one, because that is the one that's going to lead to complications later on. It's going to give you a lot of infections. It's going to give you, the saturation is going to drop. The oxygenation is going to be poor because of not able to remove the secretions. So ACBT techniques, cough assist, post exhalations, all of that will come in picture in the later part of the disease. So what I've tried to show in this slide, just click on that again. There are two animations here. Neha, yeah, they are great. So what we need to do is promote a lot of activity and prevent contact. So the stretchings and activities in the way we can. Either we use aquatic therapy, or we can, of course, use suspension exercises on land as well. I have given a cross on strengthening weights, but it's not absolute no in spinal in SMA. But try to give more of functional activities which are of moderate intensity or moderate resistance rather than heavy resistive exercises. Because yes, we want to preserve muscles, and muscles are not affected, so resistance exercises would work very well with the muscles. But at the same time, giving so much of overload may fatigue out the patient a lot. So when you give loaded or resistance exercises, make sure they're of moderate intensity. Next slide. Yeah, we can just skip that because I've covered all of it. Next. Yeah. So what are the limitations of land-based rehabilitation? Now this, we move on to the next part about aquatic therapy and what is aquatic therapy, why is it important for us to explore this modality, especially in spinal muscular atrophy. So first is lactic acid accumulation, which can trigger early fatigue, which happens a lot on land when they are performing, because we are performing a lot of postural activities and a lot of eccentric contractions as well. When they are performing exercises in the later stages, it may not be possible or very laborious to perform a certain movement, and or we require equipment like suspension or splints to carry out these activities. We also need exercise that that stimulates your cardiovascular and cardiorespiratory system. So we need to give a challenging activity, and with so much of muscle weakness, it may not be possible to perform or give such challenging activities to children and in the advanced stage of the disease. Uh, no, no, no. Go, Neha, it's Neha. No, go. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Stay there. That's the slide. Correct. So where was I? Yeah. Okay. So we need to give activities that can challenge the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, which is not possible in the later stage of the disease. And we so these are some of the fallacies or problems that we face with land-based rehabilitation, or we want to do more for the patients, but we don't understand how we can do it. So next slide. So that's where aquatic therapy comes in picture, and it can help or complement the land-based rehabilitation to eliminate these limitations. Now, it's very important to understand that it can complement land-based rehabilitation. So aquatic therapy is not an alternative to what we do. It is an addition to what we do. Just like every other modality or every other technique that we learn, aquatic therapy is also another technique for physiotherapists to do what we do, and it's not something very different from what we do. What we need to understand that is, if I do exercises in water, does that mean I don't do, I don't do anything on land? It's not true. We have to do things on land to make sure there is a good transference of what you've learned in water, and people or the children are able to carry out that activity even on land when later on, because at the end they have to live on land, right? They have to do all of their functions and day-to-day activities on land. So in water, the benefits are, of course, the lactic acid accumulation is reduced because the eccentric activity is reduced in water. The exercise can be performed easily because the gravity is not in picture, buoyancy is there. So there are a lot of other forces that are acting on the body, which help in performing certain movements, or it's just easier to perform certain movements when you are in water, especially with limb movements. The trunk movements may be a little more difficult because there's a lot of instability in water. And the most important part to understand is respiration, which I'll show you the video later on for that. It is possible to challenge them for cardiovascular activities because there is a lot of freedom now. You have many more movements that can be done in water. And so the cardiovascular and respiratory system can be challenged and improved as far as the endurance is concerned. Because of certain properties of water, the blood circulation is much better when the child is immersed in water. And yeah, I think I've covered everything. So if you can move on to the next slide. So how we achieve that? So water has certain good qualities, which I'm not going to read right now because I think I've already spoken for an hour. And I don't want to make it a very lengthy, very boring talk. So yeah, some of the properties are these: it's colorless, it's odorless, so we can go in water. Everybody enjoys water. It's like a basic element. So children enjoy water as well. Next. Density of water is 1. It's a unit density. We compare all the densities with water's density, and it is much thicker. If you see the air, the density of air is 0.0013, which is about 800 times lighter than water. What it means is, when I do a movement on land that is in the air, I do not really perceive a lot of resistance, or I do not really get a lot of sensory feedback from the air to understand what I'm doing. So if all of you just wave your hand in the air, you don't feel the air brushing against your arms or nothing. You don't understand. There's not much of sensory stimulation. But if you have been in water, or maybe tomorrow when you take bath, just immerse your hand in the bucket and just open and close your fist and see the amount of sensory input that water gives you when you do or perform a certain movement. And okay, there was some yeah, and so that input helps in building the nerves. That creates the need for the nerves to grow, to regenerate. And so density is one important you know property of the water. Next. Next is the buoyancy, which is the most important, especially for providing the freedom of the movement. Buoyancy is nothing but a force that negates gravity. And we saw that in the children when they progress to the later stages of the disease, then gravity is their biggest sort of enemy, because they have to overcome the gravity before they can perform any functional movement on land. And it's not possible with the amount of strength that they have. Then we have to come up with something as creative as suspension exercises. We need to have a massive equipment to be able to perform that movement. And even with that, there is we can only perform movement of one particular joint at the same at a time. Whereas in water, this gives us the freedom to perform multiple joint movements. It can be a synchronized movement as well. And this is because of the buoyancy, because there is a sense of weightlessness in water when we enter, because the gravity the gravity is not pulling you down as strongly as on land. Next. Yeah, I think I will skip that. It's too much in detail of how the buoyancies act. Yeah, this is important. So what I'm trying to show in this image is when you go to a certain level of immersion, how much your weight reduces by, or how much is the effect of buoyancy on your body. So if you see at the shin level, you can only experience 85% of your weight. So if you weigh 100 kgs, then if you are in shin level water, your ankles only feel 85 kilos of weight. If you are in knee deep water, then your ankles only feel 65 kgs of weight. If you are in waist deep water, then it reduces to 50%. If you are in chest deep water, it reduces to 25 to 30%. And if you are in neck deep water, then it reduces to 10%. So it's just when you are in neck deep water, your weight becomes 10 kilos instead of 100 kilos. And you can imagine what an immense benefit that can give to your, not just from the point of view of being able to perform the movement, but also for the joint health perspective. When the muscles are not active, the joints are compressed and there is so much of wear and tear of the joints that is happening. There's contractures setting in as well. There's so much of fibrosis, so much of connective tissue, in there. But when this weight is taken off, the joint health can be preserved much better. And next. Yeah. Sorry, can you go next again? Next. 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 Yeah, and water also has something called as hydrostatic pressure. So it helps in, so it's a pressure that is exerted by the water on the body. Hello. So yeah, so I was talking about hydrostatic pressure. So buoyancy reduces the amount of weight that the joints have to carry, and at the same time, hydrostatic pressure is the pressure exerted by water on our body. It engulfs the body completely, and it is equally so it exerts equally from all the sides. And as the depth increases, the pressure also increases. So what happens is the lower limbs have a more compressive force acting on them as compared to the upper body. And this is also very important. So the weight is taken off the limbs, and at the same time, the blood circulation is much better because the blood is being pumped up thanks to the hydrostatic pressure. So this is one of the problems that we see in these children. They have a lot of pedal edema because the muscles are not functioning. and that's why there's a lot of blood pooling in the extremities, but hydrostatic pressure can combat that as well. I have skipped 2 slides in between, which was viscosity and cohesion adhesion. So just to briefly talk about that, it's basically the stickiness of the water and how water can provide resistance to activities when, those are the 2 properties that are responsible for that. So if we can go to the next slide. Water is not compressible. Like we know the air, we can compress the air, it turns into liquid state, and the volume reduces a lot because air is so thin. But that doesn't happen with water. You cannot compress water and make ice out of it. So that is another quality that gives water a unique sort of property, that when you try to move in water, there's a lot of resistance offered by the water, and this is what provides the support of the hydrostatic pressure as well, because water cannot be compressed. So when you immerse something, it gives a lot of resistance to that immersion. Next. Refraction, something that the aquatic therapists have to be aware of, because if you are on the deck and the patients are in the water, or if you're out of the, your head is out of the water and you're looking at the limb alignment of the children, which is in the water, then there is going to be certain crookedness because of refraction, and you have to take that in account. If you want to observe the movements very well, then you have to go underwater and check if required. Next. Next. Okay, so I'm going to skip all of these. These are basically hydrodynamic principles, but I think we have, we have already covered a lot of aspects, and the time is running out. So just go ahead. These are again the properties that that render the resistance to the movement, and how we can change the resistance to the movement depending upon the shape of the shape of the body part, how we keep the hands, how we move. Whether we move slow or whether we move fast, we can change the resistance experienced by the body because of that. Next. Next. Yeah. So, is it possible to play those videos now, Neha?
Yes, ma'am, I'll do that.
Okay. So I just would like to give one disclaimer about the videos. These videos are for educational purpose only. So although we are showing these videos, please do not take any photos or any recordings while we are playing it. And also for the viewers otherwise who would see the recorded version of it later on, do not share these videos with anybody else, because the consent is only for the educational purpose. So yeah, if you can play the video.
Yes, ma'am, I'll just do that.
Yeah. So the video I'm trying to show is just to give you an idea as to how how the activities that are difficult on land are made easy in water. There's one video I'm going to play now, which is of no. Can you play the next video of sit to stand?
Okay.
Okay, so I think you partially saw this one, but we'll move on to the other one, and I can explain to you better with that.
Is it visible, ma'am?
The
No.
video is visible, but then it's not moving, Neha. It's not getting played.
Yes, now?
Yeah, now
Yes.
it is. But I think it's come to the end of the video. Yeah, okay. It's playing now. So if you can see, this is a patient. He's not a patient of SMA. I've taken this just as a reference for you to understand how it is in water. Patient of muscular dystrophy. And he was really struggling to stand up on land with all the effort he could not. But if you see in water, he's able to perform this movement very easily, because the water is pushing him up, water is supporting him, and there is a lot of weightlessness. So you can see the posture is also, this is not the best frame to assess that, but the posture is also much better as compared to on land. Can we play the next video? So this is just one small example for you to understand how water can benefit in facilitating these movements. And if the patients are able to perform the movements that they weren't able to perform on land, then that can help us a lot in preventing, the fibrosis, preventing the contractures. It boosts the morale of the patient also, that they are able to perform so many movements. So if you see in this video, the child is out of the water. He's trying to move the leg and the knee. So we're trying to basically, he's trying to kick, and the knee movement or the movement around the knee is very limited, and the range is very poor. But if you see the same in water, the range has improved a lot, right? This doesn't mean there was an instant strength gain when the child was performing movements in water. Of course, there wasn't. But because of buoyancy and because the weightlessness was there, the movement was, he was able to perform the movement through the entire range. Now you can imagine what kind of benefit it can give in prevention of fibrosis, especially in a hypotonic child who is very likely to go in contractures if the movements are not enough. Yes. Now this video is about, this is like a precaution that we need to take in water. It shows what kind of an effect water has on respiration of children. So if you see here on land, he's able to breathe in 1700 ml of air. And the same when we try in water, it reduces to about 1250. So 500 ml loss of tidal volume was there. Because water puts a lot of pressure on your ribcage. The hydrostatic pressure, which helps to push the blood up from the legs, it also resists the inspiration. It also resists the chest wall. And so the inspiration becomes difficult. So what we need to understand is that when we do the treatment for these children, yeah, if you can move on to the next slide. So this is something I'm trying to say from the assessment point of view. No, back. Next. Yeah, that's it. So if you see here, what I've written is contraindication for chest level immersion if patient's maximum inspiratory volume is less than 250 ml. So if we take children in water who do not have enough inspiratory volume, then they will not be able to breathe in water because of the resistance of water, only in the chest level immersion. If the immersion is lesser, if there is no water around the chest wall, then their breathing ability will not be compromised so much. There will still be some effect of water, because the internal organs and everything, there's pressure on the lower body which is pushing the diaphragm up, and so there will be some amount of reduction in the breathing ability or inspiratory ability, but not so much. So when we take these children in water, we have to be extremely precautious about their respiratory function. And so this is something what I have tried to highlight is in the aquatic therapy assessment, what different things we need to assess and focus on when we are assessing children from aquatic therapy point of view. We know what assessments we do on land when we want to prescribe exercises to these children. So in addition, or while we are doing those assessments, we have to be more careful about or more aware about these points. So first is respiration. Second, so go next. Oh, why is it become so small? Oh, is there any way? Okay, so I would request the participants to zoom it. I am not sure why. I think there's some change in the formatting there. So if you see, zoom it and see, what we also need to look at is the contractures. We have to see what contractures children have, because that can have a huge effect on the body, how it moves in water as well, and how you are able to support the children in water with those contractures. So we have to assess these contractures, take that into consideration, and preempt the limitations it can pose in water. Next. Yeah, next. So these are some of the examples of the contractures. And yeah, now okay, next. Yeah, I just spoke about this. Next. Next. Yeah. Next. Yeah. So the next point, oh, no. sorry, the slide, I mean, I meant the animation when I said next. So go back. No, the next slide. Yeah, this is fine. Perfect. So what we also need to understand is specific muscle weaknesses. So neck muscle weakness and facial muscle weakness is something that we have to be aware of, and that is a precaution for us when we take patients or children in water. Because when you're handling them in water, if they have neck weakness, there's a huge possibility that their head will flop down in water, and that is not safe for their breathing. So if the child, even if it's in the standing position, and the child is not able to control the neck, then the head may fall backwards or forwards, and that would also influence the movement of the body. So that is a very big precaution. We have to be completely aware of the neck muscle strength and how the child is able to maneuver his head. And of course, poor facial muscle weakness or poor oromotor muscle weakness, because if they are not able to close their mouth, or they are not able to control the swallowing very well, then there is a risk of aspiration. There's a huge risk of aspiration which can also be fatal if not taken care of. So this is something we really have to be aware of when we perform exercises in water. Next. Yeah, so there's some now evidence. What does evidence say about aquatic therapy for children with spinal muscular atrophy? So if you see, this is one case report for where aquatic therapy was performed for a 3-year-old child with SMA, with SMA type 3. So if you can click on the next. Yeah, so the child received 45-minute sessions and for almost 14 weeks. And if you see here, it clearly says that the outcome demonstrates a successful improvement of gross motor function as well as gait when aquatic therapy was combined with the existing treatment options. So next. Yeah, and this is a very old study. No, yeah. So they have tried or they have analyzed 50 children with SMA type 2, and so if you see here, there is addition of hydrotherapy in swimming pool. It's not physiotherapy versus hydrotherapy. It's physiotherapy and hydrotherapy together, whether it gave any added advantage or added benefit. And if you can zoom in and see at the end, they say that it does suggest that there was a measurable improvement in the quality of their daily living when the two modalities were combined. And there was type 2 and type 3 SMA patients in that. So aquatic therapy, when you add with physiotherapy, it can give an immense improvement in these children. Unfortunately, the evidence is scarce for aquatic therapy, as I said, because there are not many therapeutic settings available. There are not many practitioners worldwide. Also, the scenario has now changed quite a lot. Of course, the other parts of the world are much ahead in aquatic therapy than in India, and we hope to change that very soon. And the research has not been done about how aquatic therapy can really influence the outcomes in all of these patients. So next. Yeah, so this is not a study on SMA, but it's about early intervention. But what I wanted to highlight is that we can start the aquatic therapy for children who are very young as well. So it's not important. It's not necessary that we can only start aquatic therapy when they're 3-4 years old or nothing like that. We can do it even for very young children. And this this study says that how in early intervention, if you include aquatic therapy, it has a tremendous effect on the child's functional abilities. So next. Yeah, so we've come to the end of the webinar now, and I would like to thank all of you to be so patient, even with the technical glitches. Be so patient and listen to the whole thing. This is my pool where I practice in Mumbai, and my team. Next. This is my team, without whom, of course, I could not have been able to, present all those videos and all the material that I did. So it's acknowledgement and gratitude for my team as well, who support me for the work we are doing. And next. And finally, thank you so much. If you all would like to get in touch with me, these are my contact details. You all can call me or message me or send an email with whatever information that you need. So once again, thank you so much, IAP Women's Cell of Latur, for giving me this opportunity. It was really a great pleasure to share all the experiences I had. I think I've spoken a lot today. I've gone overboard on time, I feel. But thank you for being here on Sunday afternoon. I'm sure everybody must be hungry by now, but they are all patiently listening. So I hope you enjoyed yourselves as well.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks a lot. Ma'am,
Neha,
now
we
can
shall proceed with. Yes, we shall proceed with the question and answer session.
yes,
Yes,
thank
ma'am.
you.
Okay.
Ma'am, first question, it is from a patient.
The question.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. One of our patient, he also wants us to address this question in Hindi so that they can
Okay.
understand. They are asking कि क्या हम SMA के टाइप्स क्लासिफाई कर सकते हैं और फिजियोथेरेपिस्ट हम कौन से टाइप के SMA में हैं, क्या ये वो हमें बता सकते हैं? So how do we classify SMA and educate the patients about it?
ओके सो SMA को क्लासिफाई करना पॉसिबल है ऑन द बेसिस मतलब क्लिनिकल फीचर्स को देख के, आपके सिम्टम्स कैसे है उसको देख के, लेकिन एग्जैक्ट क्लासिफिकेशन मिलना थोड़ा कठिन है. वो जेनेटिक टेस्टिंग के ऊपर ही हम बता सकते हैं. हम अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं कि क्लासिफिकेशन के कौन सा टाइप हो सकता है, कब सिम्टम्स शुरू हुए. जैसे मैंने कहा कि टाइप 1 जो है वो 6 महीने के पहले, मतलब बच्चा पैदा होके 6 महीने के तुरंत अंदर ही आपको सिम्पटम्स नज़र आने लगते हैं, हाइपोटोनिया नज़र आने लगता है, तो वो टाइप 1 हो जाता है. थोड़ा लेट सिम्पटम्स आते हैं तो वो टाइप 2 हो जाता है. बट ये अंदाज़ा लगाना बहुत ही मुश्किल है, क्योंकि एक तो जो नए पेरेंट्स हैं जिन्होंने कभी SMA के बारे में सुना नहीं है, समझा नहीं है, उनको अगर पहली बारी ये पता चल रहा है बच्चे के बारे में, तो उनको सिम्पटम्स समझ आने में भी टाइम लगता है. तो ऐसे हो सकता है कि सिम्पटम्स 6 महीने पहले ही चालू हो गए, लेकिन पेरेंट्स को नज़र आते हैं 9-10 महीने में, जब बच्चा नेक होल्डिंग नहीं कर पाता है, बच्चा करवट नहीं ले पाता है. तो ये फिजियोथेरेपिस्ट को बताना बहुत डिफिकल्ट होगा कि कौन-सा टाइप है, स्पेशली अगर आप उनके पास बाद में आए हैं, अगर 2-3 साल के बाद आप आए हैं बच्चों को लेके, तो फिजियोथेरेपिस्ट को बताना बहुत डिफिकल्ट होगा. येस, टाइप 3-4 के में थोड़ा अंदाज़ा लगा सकते हैं, क्योंकि वो बच्चे जो है फंक्शनली काफ़ी ज़्यादा चीज़ें कर सकते हैं टाइप 1-2 के मुकाबले. तो अंदाज़ा लगाया जा सकता है, लेकिन डेफिनिटली पता करने के लिए हमको जेनेटिक टेस्टिंग ही करनी पड़ती है.
Okay. Ma'am, I shall take another question.
Mhm.
A participant named Shiv Shankar So, he is 21 years male and he's suffering from SMA since 7 years. So he says that walking is very difficult for me. I cannot sit and stand without support. And also, can you suggest me some nutritional advice and which diet that I can take?
Okay. So for diet, as I said, it would be, it won't be fair for me to give the diet advice. I would recommend that you should consult either a nutritionist or a dietitian for that, and they would be in a better place, or they would be able to give you a better advice for diet. As far as your functional limitations are concerned, when you said that you're not able to stand up, and I think walking is also becoming difficult for you, so you can look at certain exercises to improve or maintain these functions for a little longer. With physiotherapy, we can achieve that. You can also look at aquatic therapy. So even on land, it may be difficult for you to walk, or even performing sit to stand may be difficult on land, but in water that may be possible. Unfortunately, we are right now in some extraordinary circumstances with COVID pandemic. So swimming pools are all shut down, and the accessibility or the availability of aquatic therapy is not there right now. But maybe couple of months later, when things are better and the pools reopen, you can look at that.
Okay. Okay, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, for the next question, physio is asking, ma'am, can you highlight upon the fatigue levels in SMA and how do we deal with it?
Right. So yes, there is a lot of fatigue because there is nerve degeneration in SMA. So the fatigue levels are high. Also because of lactic acid accumulation, and the neuromuscular junctions already impaired. So fatigue is definitely much more as compared to any other disorder. So neuromuscular disorders may any neuromuscular disorder will have high fatigue levels. How to manage it? The best way to manage fatigue is to stagger your activities. What it means is that do not perform an activity beyond your fatigue level. If you get tired in, say, walking across the room, then you walk across the room, take a break, and once you've regained your energy a little bit, then do it again. So you have to plan your day according to your fatigue levels, and do activities that would be most easy to do or least energy expend least where there is least energy expenditure. So that's when the adaptive devices come in picture, the devices that I had shown. For example, the glass, I don't know if you all remember that, but I've shown one glass wherein there are handles on both the sides and not on one side. Okay, if you lift that glass with one arm, then it's going to be much more difficult. But if you lift it with two arms, it's going to be much easy for you, because your strength is doubled for performing the same task. And that would reduce the fatigue levels as well, because the effort you have to put in is much lesser. So use adaptive devices. Do not shy away from using these, thinking that you will become dependent on them. These are for your advantage, and use it for your advantage. Don't think it. See, it's like, you must have seen I wear specs, right? Because I can't see properly. So we do that all the time. We use adaptive devices to make sure that we can perform the functions that we are not able to perform, and there is nothing to feel dependent on it. If I don't use the specs, I will not be able to see. I will not be able to live my life at all if I don't use it. So it's as simple as that. The best way is to stagger, plan your day in advance. Do not go unplanned on your day, and use adaptive devices to reduce the fatigue.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the further questions. What are the rationale for designing the strengthening protocols in SMA, and which protocols shall we use for strengthening in SMA?
Okay. So as far as the rationale is concerned, why we need to strengthen? So any muscle strengthening exercise has a systemic effect on your nerves and muscles as well, right? When we give an input to strengthen, it is like a demand and supply sort of mechanism. You can say that if my muscles are working very hard, then somewhere there is a need for the nerves to work as well, and that secretes certain chemicals, which are these neuroprotective chemicals or anti-inflammatory cytokines, which help in preventing the degeneration of the nerves. And that's why the strengthening protocol is important. Secondly, strengthening protocol also enhances the recruitment of muscles. So it's not just the hypertrophy of muscles, but it's also the amount of muscle fibers that are getting recruited in a particular movement. That's why we need to do moderate intensity and longer duration, because you need to retrain and recruit more and more muscles. Why is that important? Because as the nerves are not giving enough of signals to the muscles for performing activities, the motor units are not getting activated. If we activate enough number of motor units, whatever, so we have to maximize whatever is available to us, because we're not able to regenerate or repair the damage that is there. So if there are 10 motor units available and we are right now using only 5, we can use the remaining 5 by giving strengthening exercises. So the rationale is that we have to, that's why we have to do strengthening of the muscles. How do we do it? What are the protocols? Usually there is a pattern called regressive resistive exercises, which means that we reduce the resistance as we progress, as the disease progresses. But it is changing now. What I would say, with the advent of regenerative medicine, because I also specialize in rehabilitation after regenerative medicine. Uh, it's important to understand that in regenerative medicine, there is a scope of repairing the injury. There is a scope of regenerating the nerve. So it may be, regenerative medicine from the point of view of gene therapy or stem cells. In either cases, if there is a possibility that the nerve can repair, the nerve can regrow, regenerate, then we have to give overload stimulus to the muscle. So if the
patients are on genetic therapy modalities or they have taken these medicines, then you might as well go for the normal, progressive resistive exercises. But you have to really evaluate as to how much resistance to give, how much to progress, or you can just choose not to regress your resistance, just keep the resistance maintained even when the child is not able to perform the movements. But resistance exercise is not the mainstay of SMA management. The mainstay is active assisted movements with, so basically repetition with functional sort of range and functional movements would be the mainstay. But strengthening is important. Strengthening is also important for respiration, where we want to prolong the respiratory decline. So if the muscles are in the good state to begin with, there may be certain, few days or few months that we can get before the child becomes dependent on invasive ventilation.
Okay. Ma'am, can we incorporate the strategies for managing the tone in these patients from a physiotherapist point of view, ma'am?
Right. So from managing tone, if you look at these children have hypotonia, and the hypotonia is not because of damage to the nerve, as in it's not because of temporary damage to the nerve. The nerves are not forming it. So there is no protein to form the nerve fibers, right? So that's why they have hypotonia. Yes, we can do tone management strategies, and that would benefit to a certain extent, especially in children who are of type 3 and 4 or adults who are of type 3 and 4, because there the nerves are formed, but just not formed properly. The protein is there, but it's not absolutely absent. In 1 and 2 also it gives little bit of benefit, but don't focus so much on tone. Once you focus on activity and active movements, the tone will automatically change or will automatically improve along with that. So tone management is not the mainstay again. For 1, 2, definitely not. For 3, 4, yes, we can give certain strategies to reduce the hypotonia.
Okay. And the next question is, how do we manage the respiratory care in chronic SMA type 1 at home with frequent involvement of the respiratory systems?
Could you repeat that again, sorry? How can we manage?
Respiratory care in chronic SMA type 1 patients at home.
Okay. So type 1 patients who are at home, they may be, so there are two categories. One, that if they require invasive or non-invasive ventilation, and if they are breathing spontaneously. If they are breathing spontaneously, what we need to focus on is, as I said, breath stacking, that we have to maintain the lung compliance. We have to make sure they're able to breathe for a longer time in their lives. So we have to do a little bit of respiratory strengthening as well. We have to do forced exhalation so that the ventilation of all of the lobes is proper, and secretion removal. So we have to focus on secretion removal, how they can get the secretions out and spit it out whenever, when required, because there's a lot of weakness of that. Secretions get accumulated, and that's what leads to the subsequent respiratory failure and dependency on invasive ventilation. So cough and cough techniques, CBT techniques, diaphragmatic breathing, lateral causal breathing, all of these we can use. Breath stacking can be used as well. For breath stacking, if they are not able to breathe very well on them by themselves and not able to stack the breaths very well, we can use ambu bag even for patients who are not dependent on ventilation. So we can use just the ambu bag and mask and sort of force the breath in their lungs, with that. So as they are trying to inhale, we give extra air and they can inhale with that. That is for patients who are breathing spontaneously. For patients who struggle to do that and maintain saturation with their regular breathing, and who are either on non-invasive or invasive ventilation, if they're on invasive ventilation, then our role is only for secretion clearance, because they're completely dependent on the ventilator anyway for breathing. So, the respiratory part is only for preventing the secretion accumulation and infection. If they are on non-invasive ventilation, then yes, we have to still maintain their respiratory muscles a little bit. So we can maybe focus on diaphragmatic and lateral muscle strengthening. We can focus on a little bit of assisted forced exhalation from the point of view of secretion clearance, but there if they're on non-invasive ventilation, I would suggest machines like cough assist, which which gives vibrations. It helps in secretion. The secretions can be mobilized very effectively with cough assist. It also helps for exhalation and it sort of it generates coughing in the patients. So I would recommend that we rely on these machines rather than hands-on for those who are already on BiPAP or who are on non-invasive ventilation support. The machines have to be used. It's not a it has to be a tailor-made use of that machine. We cannot just use that machine in one particular way for all of the patients. So that discretion is of the physiotherapist. We have to decide how those machines are to be used, but I would recommend to use that.
Okay. Ma'am, we also have a question through the live chat. Mrs. Suvarna Swami, she's asking that her daughter is 19 years old with type 2 SMA and she's totally bedridden and having problems with shallow breathing during sleep. So how can we manage? She asks.
Okay, so for that, it will be very difficult for me to suggest any strategies without seeing the patient or without really knowing what the case is. Certain recommendations, what I can give is, we need to monitor the saturation, of course, at night. If the shallow breathing is resulting in a drop in the saturation, so if it's something like apnea that is happening, sleep apnea that's happening, if that is the case, then maybe we can either look at some respiratory physiotherapy for a while and see if that's improving. If it improves, then we continue that. If it doesn't improve, then we may have to look at non-invasive ventilatory support just for the night period when we are sleeping. Certain changes in the sleeping posture may also benefit her in the shallow breathing. Maybe just stack a few pillows rather than laying flat on the bed. So rather than complete supine, she can be sleeping in slightly, a recumbent or side-lying posture. That may benefit, but it's very difficult for me to suggest any treatment strategies without knowing, her abilities otherwise.
Ma'am, we have further questions. That is there any appropriate age for the child to be treated with aquatic therapy?
As I said, not really. No, we can start as young as 1-2 months as well. There are therapists who do take children as young as that. However, in India at the moment, as I said, we have certain limitations from infrastructure point of view. If we were to treat very young children, we need such therapeutic pools that are available. We cannot take children in public swimming pools. Okay. If we have to take them in public swimming pools, then yeah, I would say about 2 to 3 years. We'll have to wait and see how the child is developing, how's the child's immunity, what kind of odomotor control they have. But otherwise, no, there is no limitation on the age. We can start seeing children very young as well. Okay. Have to manage their bowel and bladder because, of course, they cannot control it. And there's a huge risk of contamination in water if that happens. So, but there are ways of managing that. Yeah, but early intervention is very, very important and useful with aquatic therapy.
Yes, ma'am. Is there any detailed management for SMA diagnosed early around 3 to 5 months of age in a child?
Sorry, is there any detailed management? Did you say?
Management, if you can just shortly elaborate the management of SMA diagnosed in the early ages around.
Who are diagnosed early. So if they have been diagnosed very early, what we have to start doing is try and work towards developing their milestones and give them sensory inputs and especially assistance for those movements. So what happens when we are young, we learn all the movements, or the nervous system learns the movements by performing those movements. Okay, initially in a crude way, initially in a very non-refined way. But when we perform that movement multiple number of times, then the brain understands what's the best way of going about it. Okay. We have to offer that opportunity to these children as well. They cannot do it on their own because the nerves are not formed. So yes, repetition of the milestone, the movements, functional and milestone developing movements, right in the early age would help them.
Okay. And ma'am, can we also start a respiratory muscles training simultaneously with aquatic therapy?
Yes, in fact, in water, you are doing respiratory muscle strengthening anyways, because as I said, the water is providing a lot of resistance for breathing. And so that is like a resistance training for your inspiratory muscles. So you have to do it when you are in water. It's a byproduct of aquatic therapy that, respiratory strengthening is happening. Of course, if the respiratory muscles are very weak and inspiratory volume is very low, then yes, before you immerse them to chest deep water, we should first do some training on land. Try and see if we can increase the if we can increase the inspiratory capacity outside of water, and then slowly introduce them in those depths.
Okay. Okay, ma'am, these were all the questions. We have discussed really SMA in quite a bit detailed today. Thanks a lot,
Okay,
ma'am.
thank you so much. I was glad.
I shall call upon Sheetal ma'am for giving the vote of thanks for today's session. Over to you, Sheetal ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. I, Dr. Sheetal Gule for Sub-Coordinator of IPWC Latur District team, would take this opportunity on the behalf of IPWC Latur District team to thank the team member Dr. Sanju Chaha sir, IIP President Dr. Ruchi Vashne ma'am, the National Head of IPWC Dr. Pooja Kamble ma'am, West Zonal Head, and Dr. Suvarna Ganvir ma'am, State IPWC Coordinator, for giving us pleasure and opportunity to conduct today's webinar. I would also extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to respected Dr. Amruta Paranspe ma'am for giving us for delivering today's beautiful topic and enlighten us with awareness of spinal muscular atrophy. I also thanks to IP technical team for their constant support during this webinar. I thanks to our state coordinators, Dr. Snehal Patel, sub-coordinators, Dr. Uttara Mohan ma'am, Dr. Nirali ma'am, Dr. Priya Karande ma'am, for being our backbone supports in conducting this webinar. I also thank you all the participants and parents of SMA children for your positive response for today's webinar. We wish you all safe and happy Ganesh Chaturthi. Do subscribe our IIP India channel, YouTube channel for staying updated in this unlocking period of COVID-19. Thank you and have a wonderful evening to all of you. Thank you, ma'am.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity. So have a nice day, all of you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Amruta.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you all the
Bye-bye.
participants. We have posted the link of feedback for today's webinar in the chat box. Kindly fill them up. Thanks a lot, all the participants, for spending time with us for this SMA Awareness Month. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amruta. It was a
My
nice
pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.